Book 1, chapters 23 and 24 of The Wars of the Jews. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Wars of the Jews by Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 1, chapters 23 and 24. Chapter 23. Calumnies against the sons of Mariamne. Antipaterus preferred before them. They are accused before Caesar, and Herod is reconciled to them. Now Mariamne's sons were heirs to that hatred which had been borne their mother, and when they considered the greatness of Herod's crimes towards her, they were suspicious of him as an enemy of theirs, and this first while they were educated at Rome, but still more when they were returned to Judea. This temper of theirs increased upon them as they grew up to be men, and when they were come to an age fit for marriage, the one of them married their aunt Salome's daughter, which Salome had been the accuser of their mother. The other married the daughter of Archelaus, king of Cappadocia. And now they used boldness in speaking, as well as bore hatred in their minds. Now those that calumniated them took a handle from such their boldness, and certain of them spake now more plainly to the king that there were treacherous designs laid against him by both his sons, and that he was son-in-law to Archelaus, relying upon his father-in-law, was preparing to fly away, in order to accuse Herod before Caesar. And when Herod's head had been long enough filled with these calumnies, he brought Antipater, whom he had by Doris, into favor again, as a defense to him against his other sons, and began all the ways he possibly could to prefer him before them. But these sons were not able to bear this change in their affairs. But when they saw him that was born of a mother of no family, the nobility of their birth made them unable to contain their indignation. But whensoever they were uneasy, they showed the anger they had at it. And as these sons did day after day improve in their anger, Antipater already exercised all his own abilities, which were very great, in flattering his father, and in contriving many sorts of calumnies against his brethren, while he told some stories of them himself, and put it upon other proper persons to raise other stories against them, till at length he entirely cut his brethren off from all hopes of succeeding to the kingdom, for he was already publicly put into his father's will as his successor. Accordingly he was sent with royal ornaments and other marks of royalty to Caesar, excepting the diadem. He was also able in time to introduce his mother again into Mariamne's bed. The two sorts of weapons he made use of against his brethren were flattery and calumny, whereby he brought matters privately to such a pass that the king had thoughts of putting his sons to death. So the father drew Alexander as far as Rome, and charged him with an attempt of poisoning him before Caesar. Alexander could hardly speak for lamentation, but having a judge that was more skillful than Antipater, and more wise than Herod, he modestly avoided laying any imputation upon his father, but with great strength of reason confuted the calumnies laid against him. And when he had demonstrated the innocency of his brother, who was in the like danger with himself, he at last bewailed the craftiness of Antipater, and the disgrace that they were under. He was enabled also to justify himself, not only by a clear conscience which he carried with him, but by his eloquence, for he was a shrewd man in making speeches. And upon his saying at last that if his father objected this crime to them, it was in his power to put them to death, he made all the audience weep, and he brought Caesar to that pass as to reject the accusations and to reconcile their father to them immediately. But the conditions of this reconciliation were these, that they should in all things be obedient to their father, and that he should have power to leave the kingdom to which of them he pleased. After this the king came back from Rome, and seemed to have forgiven his sons upon these accusations, but still so that he was not without suspicions of them. They were followed by Antipater, who was the fountainhead of those accusations. Yet he did not openly discover his hatred to them, as revering him that they had reconciled them. But as Herod sailed by Cilicia, he touched at Eleusa, where Archelaus treated them in the most obliging manner, and gave him thanks for the deliverance of his son-in-law, and was much pleased at their reconciliation, and this the more, because he had formerly written to his friends at Rome that they should be assisting to Alexander at his trial. So he conducted Herod as far as Zephyrum, and made him presents to the value of 30 talents. Now when Herod was come to Jerusalem, he gathered the people together, and presented to them his 3 sons, and gave them an apologetic account of his absence, and thanked God greatly, and thanked Caesar greatly also, for settling his house when it was under disturbances, and had procured concord among his sons, which was of greater consequence than the kingdom itself. And which I will render still more firm, for Caesar hath put into my power to dispose of the government, and to appoint my successor. Accordingly, in the way of requital for his kindness, and in order to provide for mine own advantage, I do declare that these 3 sons of mine shall be kings. In the first place, I pray for the approbation of God to what I am about. And in the next place, I desire your approbation also. The age of one of them, and the nobility of the other 2, shall procure them the succession. Nay, indeed, my kingdom is so large that it may be sufficient for more kings. Now do you keep those in their places whom Caesar hath joined, and their father hath appointed. And do not you pay undue or unequal respects to them, but to everyone according to the prerogative of their births. For he that pays such respects unduly will thereby not make him that is honored beyond what his age requires so joyfully, so as he will make him that is dishonored sorrowful. As for the kindred and friends that are to converse with them, I will appoint to each of them, and will so constitute them, so that they may be securities for their concord, as well knowing that the ill tempers of those with whom they converse will produce quarrels and contentions among them. But if these with whom they converse be of good tempers, they will preserve their natural affections for one another. But still I desire not these only, but all the captains of my army have for the present their hopes placed on me alone, for I do not give away my kingdom to these sons, but give them royal honors only, whereby it will come to pass that they will enjoy the sweet parts of government as rulers themselves, but that the burden of ministration will rest upon myself, whether I will or not. And let everyone consider what age I am of, how I have conducted my life, what piety I have exercised, for my age is not so great that men may expect the end of my life. Nor have I indulged such a luxurious way of living as cuts men off when they are young. And we have been so religious towards God that we, have reason to hope we, may arrive at a very great age. But for such as cultivate a friendship with my sons, or so to aim at my destruction, they shall be punished by me on their account. I am not one who envy my own children, and therefore forbid men to pay them great respect. But I know that such extravagant respects are the way to make them insolent. And if everyone that comes near them does but revolve this in his mind, that if he prove a good man he shall receive a reward from me, but that if he prove seditious, his ill-intended complaisance shall get him nothing from him to whom it is shown. I suppose they will all be of my side, that is, of my son's side, for it will be for their advantage that I reign, and that I be at concord with them. But do you, O my good children, reflect upon the holiness of nature itself, by whose means natural affection is preserved, even among wild beasts. In the next place, reflect upon Caesar, who hath made this reconciliation amongst us. And in the third place, reflect upon me, who entreat you to do what I have power to command you. Continue, brethren. I give you royal garments and royal honors. I pray to God to preserve what I have determined, in case you be at concord with one another. When the king had thus spoken, and had saluted every one of his sons after an obliging manner, he dismissed the multitude, some of which gave their assent to what he had said, and wished it might take effect accordingly. But for those who wished a change of affairs, they pretended that they did not so much as hear what he had said. Chapter 24. The malice of Antipater and Doris. Alexander is very uneasy on Glaphyras' account. Herod pardons Pheroras, whom he suspected, and Salome, whom he knew to make mischief among them. Herod's eunuchs are tortured, and Alexander is bound. But now the quarrel which was between them still accompanied these brethren when they parted, and the suspicions that they had one of the other grew worse. Alexander and Aristobulus were much grieved that the privilege of the firstborn was confirmed to Antipater. So was Antipater very angry at his brethren that they were to succeed him. But then this last, being of a disposition that was mutable and politic, he knew how to hold his tongue, and used a great deal of cunning, and thereby concealed the hatred he bore to them, while the former, depending on the nobility of their births, had every thing upon their tongues which was in their minds. Many also were those who provoked them further, and many of their seeming friends insinuated themselves into their acquaintance, to spy out what they did. Now every thing that was said by Alexander was presently brought to Antipater, and from Antipater it was brought to Herod with additions. Nor could the young man say anything in the simplicity of his heart without giving offense, but what he said was still turned to calumny against him. And if he had been at any time a little free in his conversation, great imputations were forged from the smallest occasions. Antipater also was perpetually setting some to provoke him to speak, that the lies he raised of him might seem to have some foundation of truth. And if, among the many stories that were given out, but one of them could be proved true, that was supposed to imply the rest to be true also. And so, to Antipater's friends, they were all naturally so cautious in speaking, or had been so far bribed to conceal their thoughts, that nothing of these grand secrets got abroad by their means. Nor should one be mistaken if he calls the life of Antipater a mystery of wickedness. For he either corrupted Alexander's acquaintance with money, or got into their favor by flatteries, by which two means he gained all his designs, and brought them to betray their master, and to steal away, and to reveal what he either said or did. Thus did he act apart very cunningly in all points, and wrought himself a passage by his calumnies with the greatest shrewdness. While he put on a face as if he were a kind brother to Alexander and Aristobulus, but suborned other men to inform of what they did to Herod. And when any thing was told against Alexander, he would come in and pretend to be of his side, and would begin to contradict what was said, but would afterwards contrive matters so privately that the king should have an indignation at him. His general aim was this, to lay a plot, and to make it believed that Alexander lay in wait to kill his father, for nothing afforded so great a confirmation to these calumnies as did Antipater's apologies for him. By these methods Herod was inflamed, and as much as his natural affection to the young men did every day diminish, so much did it increase towards Antipater. The courtiers also inclined to the same conduct, some of their own accord, and others by the king's injunction, as particularly did Ptolemy, the king's dearest friend, as also the king's brethren, and all his children, for Antipater was all in all. And what was the bitterest part of all to Alexander, Antipater's mother was also all and all. She was one that gave counsel against them, and was more harsh than a stepmother, and one that hated the queen's sons more than is usual to hate sons-in-law. All men did therefore already pay their respects to Alexander in hopes of advantage, and it was the king's command which alienated every body from the brethren, he having given this charge to his most intimate friends, that they should not come near, nor pay any regard to Alexander or to his friends. Herod was also become terrible, not only to his domestics about the court, but to his friends abroad. For Caesar had given such a privilege to no other king as he had given to him, which was this, that he might fetch back any one that fled from him, even out of a city that was not under his own jurisdiction. Now the young men were not acquainted with the calumnies raised against them, for which reason they could not guard themselves against them, but fell under them, for their father did not make any public complaints against either of them, though in a little time they perceived how things were by his coldness towards them, and by the great uneasiness he showed upon any thing that troubled him. Antipater had also made their uncle Pheroras to be their enemy, as well as their aunt Salome, while he was talking with her as with a wife, and irritating her against them. Moreover, Alexander's wife, Glaphyra, augmented this hatred against them by deriving her nobility and genealogy from great persons, and pretending that she was a lady superior to all others in that kingdom, as being derived by her father's side from Temenus, and by her mother's side from Darius, the son of Hytaspes. She also frequently reproached Herod's sister and wives with the ignobility of their descent, and that they were every one chosen by him for their beauty, but not for their family. Now those wives of his were not a few, it being of old permitted to the Jews to marry many wives, and this king delighting in many, all which hated Alexander, on account of Glaphyra's boasting and reproaches. Nay, Aristobulus had raised a quarrel between himself and Salome, who was his mother-in-law, and besides the anger he had conceived at Glaphyra's reproaches, for he perpetually upbraided his wife with the meanness of her family, and complained that, as he had married a woman of a low family, so had his brother Alexander married one of royal blood. At this Salome's daughter wept, and told it her with this addition, that Alexander threatened the mothers of his own brethren, that when he should come to the crown, he would make them weave with their maidens, and would make those brothers of his country schoolmasters, and break this jest upon them, that they had been very carefully instructed to fit them for such an employment. Hereupon Salome could not contain her anger, but told all to Herod, nor could her testimony be suspected, since it was against her own son-in-law. There was also another calumny, which ran abroad and inflamed the king's mind, for he had heard that these sons of his were perpetually speaking to their mother, and among their lamentations for her did not abstain from cursing him, and that, when he made presents of any of Mariamne's garments to his later wives, these threatened that in no little time, instead of royal garments, they would clothe theft in no better than haircloth. Now, upon these accounts, though Herod was somewhat afraid of a young man's high spirit, yet he did not despair of reducing them to a much better mind. But before he went to Rome, whither he was now going by sea, he called them to him, and partly threatened them a little, as a king, but for the main he admonished them as a father, and exhorted them to love their brethren, and told them that he would pardon their former offenses, if they would amend for the time to come. But they refuted the calumnies that had been raised to them, and said that they were false, and alleged that their actions were sufficient for their vindication, and said withal that he himself ought to shut his ears against such tales, and would not be too easy in believing them, for that there would never be wanting those who would tell lies to their disadvantage, as long as any would give ear to them. When they had thus pacified him, as being their father, they got clear of the present fear that they were in, yet did they see occasion for sorrow in some time afterward, for they knew that Salome, as well as their uncle Pheroras, were their enemies, who were both of them heavy and severe persons, and especially Pheroras, who was a partner with Herod in all the affairs of the kingdom, excepting the diadem. He had also 100 talents of his own revenue, and enjoyed the advantage of all the land beyond the Jordan. Nay, Pheroras had been accused long before, while the queen Mariamne was alive, as if he were in a plot to poison Herod. And there came then so great a number of informers that Herod himself, though he was an exceeding lover of his brethren, was brought to believe what they said, and to be afraid of it also. And when he had brought many of those who were under suspicion to the torture, he came at last to Pheroras's own friends, none of whom did openly confess the crime, but they owned that he had made preparations to take her whom he loved and run away to the Parthians. Costobarus, too, the husband of Salome, to whom the king had given her in marriage, after her former husband had been put to death for adultery, was instrumental in bringing about this contrivance and flight of his. Nor did Salome escape all calumny upon herself, for her brother Pheroras accused her that she had made an agreement to marry Seleus, the procurator of Obodas, the king of Arabia, who was at bitter enmity with Herod. But when she was convicted of this, and all that Pheroras had accused her of, she obtained her pardon. The king also pardoned Pheroras himself the crimes he had been accused of. But the storm of the whole family was removed to Alexander, and all of it rested upon his head. There were 3 eunuchs who were in the highest esteem with the king, as was plain by the offices they were in about him. For one of them was appointed to be his butler, another of them got his supper ready for him, and the third put him into bed, and lay down by him. Now Alexander had prevailed with these men, by large gifts, to let him use them after an obscene manner; which, when it was told to the king, they were tortured and found guilty, and presently confessed the criminal conversation he had with them. They also discovered the promises by which they were induced to do so, and how they were deluded by Alexander, who had told them that they ought not to fix their hopes upon Herod, an old man, and one so shameless as to color his hair, unless they thought they would make him young again; but that they ought to fix their attention to him who was to be his successor in the kingdom, whether he would or not, and who in no time would advantage himself on his enemies, and make his friends happy and blessed, and themselves in the first place; that the men of power did already pay respects to Alexander, privately, and that the captains of the soldiery and the officers did secretly come to him. These confessions did so terrify Herod that he durst not immediately publish them, but he sent spies abroad privately, by day and by night, who should make a close inquiry after all that was done and said, and when any were but suspected of treason, he put them to death, insomuch that the palace was full of horribly unjust proceedings, for everybody forged calumnies, as they were themselves in a state of enmity or hatred against others; and many there were who abused the king's bloody passion to the disadvantage of those with whom they had quarrels, and lies were easily believed, and punishments were inflicted sooner than the calumnies were forged. He who had just then been accusing another was accused himself, and was led away to execution together with him whom he had convicted; for the danger the king was in of his life made examinations be very short. He also proceeded to such a degree of bitterness that he could not look on any of those who were not accused with a pleasant countenance, but was in the most barbarous disposition towards his own friends. Accordingly he forbade a great many of them to come to court, and to those whom he had not the power to punish actually he spake harshly. But for Antipater he insulted Alexander. Now he was under his misfortunes, and got a stout company of his kindred together, and raised all sorts of calumny against him; and for the king he was brought to such a degree of terror by these prodigious slanders and contrivances, that he fancied he saw Alexander coming to him with a drawn sword in his hand. So he caused him to be seized upon immediately, and bound, and fell to examining his friends by torture, many of whom died under the torture, but would discover nothing, nor say anything against their consciences; but some of them, being forced to speak falsely by the pains they endured, said that Alexander and his brother Aristobulus plotted against him, and waited for an opportunity to kill him as he was hunting, and then fly away to Rome. These accusations, though they were of an incredible nature, and only framed upon the great distress that they were in, were readily believed by the king, who thought it some comfort to him, after he had bound his son, that it might appear he had not done it unjustly. End of Book 1, chapters 23 and 24.